And at 10, the cult. Whenever there is a case of a missing group of people in any game, not even just horror games, the classic question of were they in a cult will be asked. And honestly, it seems like it could be possible in Poppy Playtime, just more unlikely than some other options. Even if those options are stranger, which is weird. But I do see a possibility where these workers ended up forming some sort of cult surrounding the perfect toy of Poppy before trying to recreate her success in other toys only to fail miserably. They would end up worshipping Poppy like a god if this was the case. And what do we see? We see a room built specifically for her in a glass case, with a huge Poppy painting around the front door. While yes, this would end up later having graffiti that said not to enter this room, this doesn't seem like the actions of a group that fears Poppy. Why not encase her in steel to make sure that she couldn't escape? Or why paint a giant Poppy around the door when you could just pull a Henry Emily and seal the room off? It doesn't make sense, unless, at least for a time, they worshipped her like a goddess. And at 9, death messages. The messages we get when Huggy Wuggy kills us are certainly interesting. They set the theorist's senses off instantly, since there is certainly more going on here. With lines like "don't die just yet," "more lives are at risk than just yours," "it's too early to die," and "I need you alive," there are bound to be many questions just based on us dying. Like, who's talking to us? Are they resurrecting us, or are we actually dead? And what the hell is actually going on here? These are all good questions, and most people assume that Poppy is the one who's talking to us during these death screens, but I'm not so sure if this is the case. It could simply be another character we have yet to be introduced to. With only one chapter out of seemingly 6 currently playable, we don't really know everyone we need to. It could easily be something like the owner of the company who's hiding deep in the bowels of the building who's using a loudspeaker, or someone or something with supernatural abilities who's constantly resurrecting us. And at 8, next, villains. With Huggy Wuggy seemingly meeting his end in chapter 1, we have more chapters that will be needing villains. However, who will these villains be? It's possible that these villains will be the other toys that we've seen around the facility in chapter 1. The Pink Huggy, Brawn the Dinosaur, Boogiebot, Catbee, and Candy Cat are all possibilities for the next chapters, as well as Poppy herself, who will probably be the final villain if she is one at all. More on that later. But who will be the villain of chapter 2? MatPat seems to think that it's going to be Cappy, who was the only other toy featured on more than a poster in this chapter, with the exception of Poppy herself, since we have to make a Catbee toy to move on with the game, and then that toy seemingly disappears. However, I have no idea how they plan on making Catbee scary. Like, what? It's half bee, half cat. How is that supposed to terrify me? Unless, like, I have allergies to both. Like, Huggy already looks scary enough, just the fact that he's like a monster, and then you can just add teeth to it. But a cat and a Catbee? It doesn't really seem that freaky to me. Although I will be interested to see how they do it. And at 7, Grab Pack. The Grab Pack is certainly an interesting item. Used as in essence giant sticky hands, the first half of the Grab Pack is granted to us at the very beginning of the game and is a key mechanic in the game, being the main way to solve most of the game's puzzles. However, one of the big questions is why do we need this Grab Pack? Other than electricity puzzles, grabbing tape, and blocking progression, why are we limited to using this? It's almost as if we don't have any actual hands to use, but that raises the question, how are we able to use the Grab Pack if that was the case? Since we would normally just assume that we're just pulling triggers on some handles or something. But even before getting the Grab Pack, we don't see any of our body, not even our normal hands. And why is that? Well, maybe there's more of an explanation coming later on. And at 6, Poppy's a good guy. The first chapter of Poppy Playtime ends with us opening Poppy's display case with the lights flickering and her saying, "You opened my case," in what also seems to be an almost thankful tone. This is also something that MatPat mentioned in his game theory episode on the subject. This also relates to who Matt believes is behind Poppy, or I guess who Poppy really is, and that's Stella, a woman who is obsessed with trying to live forever and bringing joy to children like her toys did for her. And what better way to do that than being turned into a living toy? Well, there are actually plenty of ways that you could do that that don't involve having to convert your living flesh into a doll that talks to kids, but hey, it's an indie game. Plus, if Stella wanted to be a toy, she wouldn't be mad about being turned into one, she'd be delighted. And now, thanks to you opening her door, she can go and bring that joy to children. Or will she? Halfway through into number 5, Global Massacre. The idea that there is something bigger at stake here is another idea that's been floating around the internet. Thanks to the death line of "there are more lives at stake than just yours, wake up," which could also allude to Dream Theory, but I'm not touching that one with a top 10-foot pole. Get it? The global massacre idea started because, well, what else is going on to cause more lives to be at stake here other than toys actively trying to kill you? Plus, this only happens if you die and don't get rid of Huggy Wuggy at the end of the chapter. Since he bashes his head multiple times, I'm going to guess that they're definitely dead at this point. Plus, this thing is like 11 feet tall and definitely wants to go on a mass killing spree, with one section of the trailer suggesting that it just kills for fun and doesn't require sustenance. So what's the overall goal here? Well, we still don't know. With only one chapter out, we can't really gather all that much evidence, but alas, we're guessing anyway. Mostly because I wanted a break from FNAF, and this seems like something you'd all be into. And at 4, Poppy's hair. Poppy's hair is meant to smell like poppies because that's her name. However, poppies themselves don't really have much of a smell unless you're talking about the ones made for a certain kind of substance. Or the ones used to make a certain kind of substance, I should say. Those poppies are used for various illicit substances, however, they are also good at putting people to sleep. It was even used as a form of treatment when medicine wasn't really as advanced as it is today. So, could this have been the point behind Poppy's hair? Could this doll have actively been selling to parents instead of their kids? If this doll was shown to be able to keep kids calm or put them to sleep, I'm sure a load of parents, especially in the 1960s when Poppy was invented, would have been down for it, especially if the kids were like me. I literally at one point tried to run into traffic. I knew what adulthood would be like. And we know that the company behind Poppy and the others are certainly not the pinnacle of corporate decency. Definitely not setting the gold standard for how to treat their employees, so is it possible that they could have done this and not really cared about the consequences? It's an indie game. Absolutely. Getting close to the end, and in number 3, people are toys. One of the biggest theories that I've seen that seems to be going in the right direction is that the monster toys we've been dealing with are actually humans. But not the classic humans possess these toys way, but rather they're made of human flesh and bone. These are intentionally a human monstery toy hybrid that was an attempt to recreate the success of Poppy. It's worth noting that when we take care of Huggy, he does bash his head off multiple things on the way down. However, these hits also end up leaving blood behind. And Poppy's eyes are really realistic. Now, an animatronic wouldn't leave blood behind if it's bashed its head, so that removes the possibility of these being animatronics, thank God. So the only thing that would really leave blood is an organic being with flesh. And as we learn in a moment from the trailer for the game, Huggy Wuggy has a digestive tract. When showing Poppy's voice box, it's covered and even dripping with blood. So what's the deal here? Well, the employees did disappear, right? And the game even tells us that they never left the building, so where are they? They're in the toys. But ultimately, in at number 2, FNAF Multiverse. Okay, look now, I know this is going to make a lot of Poppy heads mad, but this is something that this channel is in essence obligated to talk about. Now, do I believe FNAF and Poppy Playtime share a universe or even a multiverse? No, not at all. But am I talking about this for the thumbnail? Abso-freaking-lutely. So, right off the bat, there are some similarities that we should point out between Poppy Playtime and FNAF. 1. They're both indie horror titles. They both also feature childhood figures turned killers, and that in some way all of these characters are human, be it by possession in FNAF's case, or by literally made of flesh to be your tormentor like in Poppy Playtime. However, are there any other similarities that we can use in-universe? Well, while there may be no references to FNAF in the games from what I could tell, this does seem to be the story of FNAF just on another Earth, where instead of making Circus Baby and the Funtime animatronics, William could have just made the Poppy doll instead. Notice how the two share a similar design. And while yes, Poppy was made in the 60s, maybe this is just what happened if William was born earlier than he was supposed to be. I mean, of course, this is all for fun, and is most certainly not the case, but it's fun to speculate anyway, right? Plus, thumbnail. Finally, in number 1, we are a toy. This is such an interesting theory that I felt the need to talk about it. The idea that we ourselves are a toy is so seemingly off the rails that it fits perfectly within this story. If people are being turned into monstrous versions of these toys, and Huggy Wuggy was Experiment 1006, what if we are Experiment 1007, or are going to be 107? Starting off the game, we don't really see any of our own body, not even our hands like I mentioned before, only being able to grab stuff with the grab pack given to us at the start of the game. So why would we not be able to use our own hands if we are human. That would just be instinctive, right? Well, it would make sense if we were a toy, but the game didn't want us to know that yet. It could also explain how we're brought back to life over and over, and that one death line of death isn't permanent, since being a toy combined with a human would most likely not let us die permanently, especially if there is some other entity that's able to resurrect us. Now, I don't know, but being a toy sounds like it could certainly be where this game is going. It wouldn't be that big of a leap, honestly. And after dealing with FNAF for like, what, 2 years at this point, I feel like this is not that big of a deal. It hasn't been 2 years, it's been like 1.5 maybe. Firstly, we need to ask, what is Experiment 1006? This experiment is first introduced to us by name in one of the death screens that we can see after we're killed by Huggy Wuggy. This screen says EXP.1006, isn't he wonderful? Before putting us back in the game. EXP in this case is referring to scenario, not experience points, unfortunately. The next time we hear a mention of this is actually at the end of the chapter in the final tape called Unknown, where the unnamed scientist says, final log in relation. Experiment 1006, the prototype. Coordination and cooperation is evidently within his skill set, as well as the skill set of all other experiments of his type. Though still missing, today's events are no doubt in relation to him. His absence was a flawed scientific process, which should have under no circumstances been left unaccounted for. That's why I'm making this log, so that the same mistake won't be made twice. Any future experiments will need to be contained and disposed of in a secure location. I'm not worried about myself. One breakthrough and I'll be back. We must forge onwards in the name of science. But for those who are beneath us, understand it or not, end note. And the final time we hear about this experiment is actually in the background text for the trailer of the game. This section, present at 43 seconds, says Experiment 1006, the prototype. He seems serviceable as the prime example for the type of vessel which we are trying to create. Despite his digestive tract being wired properly, the prototype finds no necessity for sustenance, unlike the others. All other experiments can survive while subsisting on much larger portions. Now, this is all well and good, but what does all that information actually tell us? Well, thanks to the trailer text, we know that whoever Experiment 1006 is, they looked like they could be the template for the other experiments going forward. Their naming system also seems to indicate that they were the 6th attempt at creating such a creature, as indicated by MapHat, which I guess makes sense. We also know that despite having a digestive tract, the experiment doesn't need to eat and doesn't seem to try and eat based on the wording of the actual phrase, saying finds no necessity for sustenance instead of just has no need for it. We also know that they went missing and at the time of the final log were still missing, and seems like they are able to cooperate and coordinate with others. And that this character, whoever it is seen as male, which removes Kissy Missy, the pink Huggy, and Poppy from the running. The reasonable assumption that Huggy is Experiment 1006 is thanks to the fact that he's the main antagonist of this chapter. However, there are a couple things that I'd like to point out. Mainly the fact that if this experiment went missing and was still missing at the end of this log, as well as them wanting to dispose of and contain their other experiments like some weird SCP Foundation, how was he back come the start of the game? And how is he where they decided to seemingly store the other experiments, since this was supposed to be locked up securely? Considering how Poppy is here and presumably the others are as well, this must be their version of the SCP containment zone, right? Because if it is, it makes no sense for Huggy to be here if he is Experiment 1006. It's also worth mentioning that Experiment 1006 is seen as the template for how they want to create their other creatures. And like, why would the one that seems to be absolutely kill crazy be their template? That just seems like a bad idea, unless that's what they intended. Plus, they said that this experiment isn't actively seeking sustenance and finds no necessity for it, but Huggy is actively trying to kill and eat us from what the death screen seems to indicate. So what's the deal there? And just as Experiment 1006 Isn't He Beautiful could be referring to Huggy, couldn't it also be referring to us as well? I mean, all the other death lines are about us in one way or another, so why would this one be any different? It just seems like they were hyping this experiment up so much that it can't reasonably be Huggy Wuggy, especially since that experiment had escaped. And who comes back after a while? Us. It also ties into the we are a toy theory that's been circulating on the internet, since if we are a toy, we could very well be Experiment 1006 that fled after we realized how messed up everything was, but eventually we came back when Poppy sent us a letter. Which, I mean, that's a whole other can of worms, right? Like, how would Poppy know to send us a letter specifically? Cause that's a whole other thing I didn't think of. I'm thinking of it as I'm reading the script. Hold on. What? How did Poppy know to send us a letter? That's sus. That's mega sus. As I said last time, Poppy is a sussy baka. Plus, these kinds of revelations are nothing new to the indie horror scene. A twist like You Are a Toy that was an experiment is honestly expected at this point, especially with the standards that FNAF has set in the indie world. And we know that this series draws inspiration from FNAF since it's made by Mob Studios, started by Enchanted Mob, who has made plenty of FNAF-based Minecraft animations, including the Disconnected series of original music videos, which I used to watch that a lot, actually. I used to watch it to try to gain inspiration for FNAF lists. But with such a heavy amount of content relying on FNAF, it's only natural for FNAF to be an inspiration in Poppy Playtime, as well as Bendy and the Ink Machine, which is something that many people seem to point out in the comments of top 10 scary Poppy Playtime theories when I talked about the possibility of them being in the same universe, which was only meant to be so I could include it in the thumbnail. So, because, you know, the people who watch the FNAF stuff would actually click on it at that point, but now that idea is actually seemingly stronger. Company history. What we do know about the company that seems to be the main antagonist of the Poppy Playtime series, called Playtime Company, is that they seemingly hit it big in the 1960s with the release of Poppy, the world's first truly intelligent toy. This Poppy doll put them on the map, marking them as the king of the toys until dolls fell out of style probably around the late 70s, causing Playtime Co. to have to update their repertoire and come out with newer toys like Huggy Wuggy and Candy Cat among others. This helped them bring back some of the business they lost, but this didn't seem like enough, because they soon began seemingly experimenting with more realistic dolls in an attempt to recreate Poppy's success. Because let's face it, even if there was a truly intelligent version of this doll, not every version of Poppy would have been like that, only the one they used in the commercials, and later we realized at the end of the chapter. Just like how ice cream in commercials is mashed potatoes, it's not really what you get, it's just to make it look good. However, this then brings us to the events of Tape Unknown, the final tape in which, quote, final log in relation, experiment 1006, the prototype. Coordination and cooperation is evidently within his skill set, as well as the skill set of all other experiments of his type. Though still missing, today's events are no doubt in relation to him. His absence was a flawed scientific process which should have been under no circumstances left unaccounted for. That's why I'm making this log, so that the same mistake won't be made twice. Any future experiments will need to be contained and disposed of in a secure location. I'm not worried about myself, one breakthrough and I'll be back. We must forge onwards in the name of science, but for those who are beneath us, understand it or not. And note, despite some weird grammar moments in there. Which then caused the company to seal away their experiments in an underground bunker, which we seemingly explore in Chapter 1. Next, toys are organic beings. We are pretty certain that the toys we see around the factory are both part toy, but also an organic creature of some sort. We know this thanks to various sources such as the trailer for the game and the sheer amount of blood in the game. Like, if these monsters were animatronic or some other form of sentient being that got possessed or whatnot, like, then we would know, okay? Like a classic toy that was just infused with the soul of a kid or something wouldn't end up bleeding when bashing its head on a pipe, and wouldn't really need to eat, which is something that we learned from the trailer, which has a hidden message in it that says, Experiment 1006, the prototype. He seems serviceable as the prime example for the type of vessel which we are trying to create. Despite his digestive tract being wired properly, the prototype finds no necessity for sustenance, unlike the others. All other experiments can survive while subsisting on much larger portions. Whether this is referring to Huggy Wuggy or the player is another story entirely, but either way, these toys appear to be organic beings that were created in some form of experiment. I say experiment, but it was probably a very torturous experience in reality. That would have been being turned into a toy, I'm sure, is not an easy process. Next up, Chapter 2 comes in 2022. Recently, the trailer for Poppy Playtime Chapter 2 was released. Well, recently at the time that I wrote this. It was a teaser trailer, so we didn't actually learn anything, but we did get a projected release date of early 2022. That could mean many things, if I'm honest, and it doesn't exactly have to stay as early 2022. I mean, take Security Breach for example, we've been waiting for that thing for like 2 years. I mean, it's because there was a kind of like a pandemic going on, but still, there could be delays that prolong the development of Chapter 2, unless they're already basically complete and all they need to to do is release it, which could certainly be an interesting strategy if they wanted to slowly hype it up, but nevertheless that's probably not where they're going with it. The likelihood that it will get delayed is unknown, but currently we know that Chapter 2 is set to come out probably the first quarter of 2022. Next, toys are probably people. Okay, well this isn't confirmed in the game, but I think it's fairly safe to say that the toys are being created from people. That the employees at Playtime Co. were being transformed into toys through some freaky process that resulted in them being hungry for human nuggets. This is mostly based on Stella and Poppy, however, where the two characters are voiced by the same person. This combined with other pieces of evidence like the fact that Poppy's voice box was covered in blood, the creepy human-like eyes inside the doll's head, the fact that this AI is supposed to be so advanced they consider her the first truly intelligent doll that can have full-on conversations with you, and Stella's love for toys, desire to be immortal, and the desire to make kids happy like her toys made her, that basically gives you a recipe for homicidally inclined children's toys. Well, at least not in her case, because she was willing. The other theory is that to make a good toy, the person being turned into that toy needs to be willing to live as a toy, so anyone who is forced into it or not a willing subject ends up getting turned into something like the Huggy Wuggy Stabby Wabby monster we saw in Chapter 1, which is certainly not ideal in my personal professional opinion. I say this as a man who has turned countless humans into toys, but I digress. Could Poppy Playtime be a prequel to Toy Story? I mean, that can explain all the toys' sentience beyond just their imagination. It's the kids' imagination. That's why the toys are alive. I'm almost falling over. No, it's because they're actually humans that were turned into toys. Calling it right now. Poppy Playtime. I almost said Poppy Whoppy. Poppy Playtime is a prequel to Toy Story. You heard it here first, folks. Finally, experiments. There have been multiple experiments over the various stages of Playtime Co.'s development, resulting in at the very least 6 experiments, with experiment 1006 being the most viable as a template. However, is an experiment that ultimately escapes somehow. It's unknown if it comes back or is caught, however most people assume this to be the Huggy Wuggy we fight in Chapter 1. This leaves 5 other experiments in the wind, which most likely represent the other 5 toys that we learned about in Chapter 1. Candy Cat, Catbee, Kissy Missy, Brawn, and Boogie Bot. These could be the other experiments, however there also seems to be a 7th, considering how this was an example that they wanted to recreate. So if they found something that they wanted to recreate, realistically they wouldn't just stop there, right? If anything, it would serve as more motivation to keep making human toys.